Harlem was a place where power was rarely questioned and survival was never guaranteed. In the shadows of New York's towering skyline, men vanished for far less than challenging authority. Yet, in the very center of this unforgiving world, one man lived openly, moved freely, and ruled quietly while some of the most feared crime families in America chose restraint over assassination. This was not mercy. This was respect born from calculation. Ellsworth, Bumpy Johnson rose in an era where violence was the most common language of organized crime. Italian Mafia families controlled much of New York's underworld, enforcing obedience through fear, executions, and absolute discipline. Their reputation was simple: cross them, and the consequences were permanent. Harlem, however, stood apart. It was not just another territory, it was a cultural nerve center, deeply connected to race, politics, and community identity. Any disruption there carried consequences far beyond money. Bumpy Johnson understood this reality earlier than most. His power did not emerge overnight, nor was it built solely on brutality. Growing up in hardship shaped his worldview, but it was his intelligence that defined his ascent. He studied people, patterns, and power structures with patience. While others chased dominance through bloodshed, Bumpy focused on stability. He knew chaos attracted attention, and attention brought law enforcement. Survival required something more refined. As Harlem's influence grew, so did Bumpy's reputation. He became a figure woven into the daily life of the community. Families depended on him. Local businesses trusted him. His presence created order in a world that thrived on disorder. This loyalty was not forced, it was earned. And that loyalty mattered more than weapons. The Mafia noticed. They always did. From the outside, Bumpy appeared to be a rival. From closer inspection, he was something far more dangerous to eliminate. Harlem's underground economy generated enormous revenue, much of it flowing smoothly because of Bumpy's control. Numbers operations, protection systems, and silent political arrangements functioned efficiently under his leadership. Removing him would not just create a power vacuum, it would fracture a delicate ecosystem that benefited everyone involved, including the Mafia itself. What separated Bumpy from countless others who met violent ends was his understanding of boundaries. He never publicly challenged Mafia authority. He never embarrassed their leadership. He never broke agreements. His moves were deliberate, calculated, and quiet. He positioned himself not as a threat, but as a necessity. The Mafia respected predictability. Bumpy offered exactly that. Unlike impulsive figures who brought chaos and police pressure, Bumpy practiced restraint. Violence was a last resort, not a tool for ego. This restraint reduced attention from law enforcement, something the Mafia valued deeply. Excessive bloodshed endangered entire operations. In this sense, Bumpy was not a liability, he was an asset. There was also the matter of symbolism. Bumpy Johnson represented more than a man. He symbolized Harlem's autonomy. Killing him would not simply remove a leader. It would ignite resentment, unrest, and unity among groups that otherwise remained divided. The Mafia had learned through experience that creating martyrs often created larger enemies. Harlem, already sensitive and volatile, was not a place where mistakes could be undone. Behind closed doors, discussions about Bumpy were cautious and measured. He was not spoken of as prey, but as a factor that had to be accounted for. His intelligence, discipline, and control made him unpredictable. In one critical way, he could not be easily replaced. Bumpy himself understood this delicate balance. He sacrificed short-term dominance to preserve long-term survival. He accepted cooperation where others would have chosen confrontation. Every decision he made was shaped by an awareness that staying alive required more than strength. It required foresight. As years passed, his continued existence became proof of something rare in organized crime: respect without submission. The streets spoke his name with admiration. His enemies spoke it with caution. In a world governed by fear, Bumpy Johnson mastered something far more enduring: strategic respect. Yet survival alone does not explain why the Mafia chose to honor him rather than eliminate him. Beneath the surface of mutual benefit lay a silent understanding, one forged through a single decision that permanently altered the balance of power in New York. What ultimately sealed Bumpy Johnson's fate as untouchable was not fear, not loyalty, and not violence, but a hidden agreement that redefined who truly controlled Harlem, and why the Mafia could never afford to break it. Harlem's survival depended on balance, and balance was never accidental. Beneath the surface of everyday life, unseen arrangements shaped who lived, who fell, and who remained untouchable. While outsiders believed the Mafia allowed Bumpy Johnson to exist out of fear or tolerance, the truth was far more calculated. What protected him was not his reputation alone, but a silent alliance that transformed Harlem from contested ground into controlled territory. At a time when New York's criminal landscape was defined by expansion and consolidation, the Mafia faced a strategic dilemma. Harlem was profitable, but it was also unpredictable. Cultural tensions, racial dynamics, and political sensitivity made heavy-handed control dangerous. The Mafia understood that force worked in some neighborhoods, but Harlem demanded a different approach. Direct domination would invite resistance, scrutiny, and long-term instability. Bumpy Johnson emerged as the solution to a problem the Mafia could not solve on its own. Rather than attempting to replace him, they observed his methods. Harlem, under Bumpy, was orderly. Money moved quietly. Violence stayed minimal. Law enforcement pressure remained manageable. The streets were stable, and stability was rare currency in the criminal underworld. The Mafia recognized that removing him would mean inheriting chaos, and chaos threatened profits. This realization marked a turning point. Harlem was no longer viewed as a territory to conquer, but as a territory to manage indirectly. Bumpy became the buffer between the Mafia and the volatility of Harlem's streets. Through him, business could continue without exposure. Through him, agreements could be honored without confrontation. The alliance was never announced. It did not require ceremonies or written contracts. It was enforced by mutual understanding. Bumpy controlled Harlem's internal operations. The Mafia benefited from steady revenue streams and reduced risk. Both sides understood the cost of breaking this balance, and neither was willing to pay it. What made this alliance unusual was the absence of domination. Bumpy was not treated as a subordinate. He was treated as a partner whose cooperation was essential. This distinction mattered. Respect replaced threat. Strategy replaced intimidation. In an environment where betrayal was common, reliability became the most valuable trait of all. Bumpy's role extended beyond crime. He served as an informal stabilizer, ensuring that conflicts did not escalate beyond control. He prevented reckless actions that would draw federal attention. His leadership reduced the need for Mafia intervention, allowing them to operate with minimal visibility. In return, his authority in Harlem remained undisputed. The Mafia understood that influence did not always require presence. Sometimes, the strongest position was the one held indirectly. Harlem became proof of that philosophy. As long as Bumpy remained in control, the system functioned. As long as the system functioned, there was no incentive to disrupt it. This arrangement also protected the Mafia politically. Harlem was deeply connected to local power structures, activists, and institutions. Any sudden disruption risked exposure far beyond the streets. By allowing Bumpy to maintain order, the Mafia insulated itself from unwanted attention. The alliance acted as a shield. Bumpy, in turn, used this protection to reinforce his authority. He understood that his survival depended on consistency. He honored boundaries. He respected agreements. He ensured that Harlem remained predictable. Every decision he made reflected awareness that his power came from trust, not fear. Over time, this silent alliance reshaped Harlem's criminal hierarchy. Independent operators deferred to Bumpy. Outside forces hesitated to intervene. Harlem became a closed system, governed internally but supported externally. The Mafia's influence existed without footprints, while Bumpy's leadership remained visible and uncontested. This balance did not weaken either side, it strengthened both. The Mafia secured profits without exposure. Bumpy secured longevity without surrender. Together, they created a model of cooperation rarely seen in organized crime, where restraint proved more powerful than force. Yet this alliance was fragile. It depended entirely on one variable: Bumpy Johnson himself. His discipline, intelligence, and restraint held everything together. Without him, the system would collapse, or worse, explode. And as time passed, forces beyond the streets began to close in. Law enforcement scrutiny intensified. Political pressure mounted. The very stability that protected Bumpy also made him a focal point. The question was no longer whether the alliance worked, but how long it could survive external pressure. What neither side fully anticipated was that the greatest threat to this silent alliance would not come from rival gangs or internal betrayal, but from an unseen force determined to dismantle the balance that had kept Harlem under control for decades. From the outside, Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson appeared to be just another powerful figure who had survived longer than most. But those who truly understood Harlem knew his greatest weapon was never physical force. It was his mind. In an underworld dominated by impulsive brutality, Bumpy's intelligence separated him from men who rose quickly and died even faster. Unlike many crime figures of his era, Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson approached power as a system, not a battlefield. Every move he made was calculated within a larger framework of cause and consequence. Violence, in his view, was a failure of strategy, not a demonstration of strength. This philosophy alone made him an anomaly in organized crime. Bumpy paid close attention to patterns. He studied how territories changed hands, how law enforcement reacted to instability, and how alliances collapsed under pressure. Where others saw opportunity in chaos, he saw danger. He understood that unpredictability invited scrutiny, and scrutiny destroyed empires. His leadership style emphasized order, routine, and quiet control. The Mafia noticed this difference early. Their own history had taught them that reckless operators attracted federal attention and destabilized entire networks. Bumpy's Harlem remained comparatively calm. Murders were rare. Conflicts were resolved internally. Operations ran smoothly, without public disruption. This discipline made him valuable, not just tolerable. Bumpy also understood people. He knew which individuals craved power, which feared exposure, and which valued stability above all else. This insight allowed him to neutralize threats without confrontation. Potential rivals were absorbed, redirected, or isolated long before they became dangerous. By the time opposition realized what was happening, the outcome was already decided. Information was another pillar of his power. Harlem was a crossroads of politics, culture, and underground economies. Bumpy positioned himself at the center of this flow. He knew who owed favors, who needed protection, and who could not afford conflict. This knowledge gave him leverage that no weapon could match. Acting against him meant risking exposure, disruption, or unintended consequences. The Mafia respected intelligence because it created predictability. Bumpy delivered exactly that. He honored agreements consistently. He did not act emotionally. He avoided unnecessary escalation. These traits reduced risk for everyone involved. From a strategic perspective, eliminating him would replace a known variable with an unknown one, a gamble the Mafia rarely took without absolute necessity. Bumpy's intelligence also extended to optics. He maintained a low profile, avoiding public displays of excess or dominance. He understood that visibility invited envy and investigation. By blending into the background while quietly controlling outcomes, he protected himself from both rivals and authorities. His restraint frustrated enemies who thrived on reaction and spectacle. This mental discipline reinforced his reputation. People spoke of him not as a tyrant, but as a thinker. Decisions attributed to him carried weight because they were rarely impulsive. Even his adversaries acknowledged that crossing him rarely ended well, not because of retaliation, but because of consequences that unfolded slowly and decisively. The Mafia's leadership valued this trait deeply. Their own survival depended on long-term thinking. Bumpy mirrored that mindset, making cooperation natural rather than forced. He did not need to be reminded of boundaries, he understood them intuitively. This mutual understanding reduced friction and reinforced respect. Over time, Bumpy's mind became his shield. Threats dissolved before reaching him. Conflicts were redirected away from Harlem. His influence expanded not through conquest, but through trust in his judgment. People deferred to him because his decisions kept them alive. Yet this reliance on intelligence carried a hidden risk. The entire structure depended on Bumpy's continued clarity and control. Any disruption, mental, legal, or physical, would destabilize the system instantly. The more effective his leadership became, the more fragile the balance grew. And beyond Harlem's streets, forces were watching closely. Federal authorities were beginning to recognize that stability itself could be evidence of control. The same intelligence that protected Bumpy was also making him increasingly visible to those determined to dismantle organized crime at its roots. As pressure mounted from outside forces, the question was no longer whether Bumpy Johnson was smart enough to survive, but whether intelligence alone could protect him from a system designed to break even the most disciplined minds. Power in the criminal world was often measured by fear, but fear was fragile. It faded the moment a stronger force appeared. Ellsworth, Bumpy Johnson, understood this weakness better than most, which is why he built something far more difficult to destroy. While others ruled through intimidation, Bumpy ruled through loyalty. And in Harlem, loyalty was not symbolic, it was protective armor. Harlem was not just a territory under Bumpy's control, it was a community that saw him as a stabilizing force. His influence reached beyond illegal operations and into the everyday survival of people who lived there. Families benefited from his protection. Local businesses operated without constant disruption. Conflicts were contained before they spilled into public chaos. This created a sense of order in an environment where disorder was the norm. This loyalty was organic, not enforced. Bumpy avoided unnecessary cruelty. He did not exploit his own people recklessly. When decisions were made, they were made with an awareness of long-term consequences for the neighborhood. Over time, this approach earned him trust that could not be bought or threatened into existence. The Mafia observed this dynamic carefully. They understood that killing a man who ruled by fear removed a problem. Killing a man protected by loyalty created many more. Harlem was densely connected socially, politically, and culturally. Any violent move against Bumpy would ripple outward, creating instability that extended far beyond the streets. Bumpy's presence acted as a pressure valve. He absorbed tensions that would otherwise explode. Disputes were resolved quietly. Ambitions were managed rather than encouraged to clash. This containment protected not only Harlem, but the Mafia's broader operations in New York. The fewer disturbances, the less attention from authorities. The Mafia had learned painful lessons about community backlash. Heavy-handed actions often triggered resistance, investigations, and political consequences. Harlem, with its visibility and symbolic weight, was not a place where mistakes could be erased. Bumpy's death would not be interpreted as a routine elimination, it would be seen as an invasion. Loyalty also translated into silence. Information rarely leaked from Harlem without Bumpy's consent. This silence shielded criminal operations from exposure. The Mafia relied on this discretion. Removing the man who guaranteed it would introduce unpredictability, and unpredictability was the enemy of organized crime. Bumpy reinforced this loyalty by maintaining consistency. He honored his commitments. He avoided sudden shifts in behavior. People knew where he stood and what to expect. This predictability made his leadership dependable. In contrast, power vacuums bred opportunists who disrupted systems for personal gain. The Mafia preferred systems over individuals. Bumpy had become a system. His removal would dismantle years of carefully maintained balance. Harlem would fracture into competing factions, each louder and more reckless than the last. Violence would increase. Police attention would intensify. Profits would shrink. The cost-benefit analysis was clear. Bumpy also understood that loyalty required constant maintenance. He remained visible enough to reassure his supporters, but distant enough to preserve authority. He avoided excess that could breed resentment. His restraint reinforced the perception that his leadership was grounded in responsibility rather than ego. This dynamic created an invisible barrier around him. Any attempt to move against Bumpy would encounter resistance, not necessarily through violence, but through exposure, disruption, and refusal to cooperate. Harlem would become unmanageable. The Mafia knew this and adjusted accordingly. Respect, in this context, was not admiration. It was acknowledgement of reality. Bumpy's loyalty network made him expensive to remove. Too many consequences followed his absence. Too many systems depended on his presence. Yet loyalty, while powerful, was not invincible. It relied on continued trust and visible stability. Any prolonged disruption, legal pressure, imprisonment, or external intervention could weaken the bonds that protected him. The question was not whether loyalty worked, but how long it could withstand forces beyond Harlem's control. As years passed, that pressure began to mount. Federal authorities intensified their focus. Political climates shifted. The same loyalty that once shielded Bumpy now drew attention to the man holding everything together. And when that pressure finally broke through Harlem's protective barrier, it set in motion a chain of events that tested whether loyalty alone could save a man the Mafia had chosen not to kill, but might no longer be able to protect. In the criminal underworld, fear was the default currency. It ensured obedience, silence, and control. Yet in rare cases, fear became inefficient. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson existed within one of those rare exceptions, where the Mafia chose restraint over dominance not because they lacked power, but because exercising it would cost more than it gained. By the time Bumpy had fully established control over Harlem, the Mafia had already assessed him from every angle. They understood his operations, his influence, and his limitations. What they saw was not a reckless challenger, but a disciplined operator who understood the unspoken rules of organized crime. This recognition shifted their approach from confrontation to calculation. Respect, in this context, was strategic. Bumpy did not provoke. He did not embarrass leadership. He did not attempt to expand beyond his territory. His ambitions were contained, predictable, and aligned with maintaining order. For the Mafia, this predictability was invaluable. It allowed them to plan, allocate resources, and minimize risk. The Mafia's restraint was also shaped by precedent. They had eliminated powerful figures before, only to face unintended consequences, internal chaos, external scrutiny, and fractured alliances. Harlem presented an amplified version of that risk. Any aggressive move would attract attention not just from law enforcement, but from political and social institutions sensitive to disruption in the neighborhood. Bumpy's restraint mirrored their own long-term thinking. He avoided unnecessary violence, reduced public disturbances, and kept operations quiet. This alignment of philosophy created mutual understanding. Neither side needed to assert dominance because both benefited from stability. The Mafia also recognized that Bumpy's authority reduced competition. Independent operators who might otherwise cause disruption deferred to his leadership. This centralized control minimized friction and simplified oversight. From a strategic perspective, one reliable intermediary was preferable to multiple unpredictable rivals. Fear was replaced by respect because respect preserved structure. Killing Bumpy would dismantle a system that worked. Keeping him alive maintained equilibrium. This decision was not emotional, it was practical. Bumpy, for his part, reinforced this dynamic through consistency. He honored agreements without exception. He avoided impulsive decisions. He communicated boundaries through action rather than words. Over time, this reliability became his strongest defense. The Mafia did not need to test him because he never tested them. This restraint also reflected confidence. The Mafia knew they could act if necessary. Choosing not to was a demonstration of control, not weakness. In this sense, allowing Bumpy to operate was a calculated display of dominance through patience rather than force. As years passed, this relationship matured into an unspoken understanding. Bumpy remained within his lane. The Mafia maintained distance. Each side benefited without overexposure. This equilibrium held because both recognized the cost of disruption. Yet this balance was conditional. Respect could shift if circumstances changed. External pressures, internal mistakes, or perceived disloyalty could alter the calculation. Bumpy understood this and adapted accordingly, constantly reinforcing his value through stability. However, the longer this arrangement lasted, the more dependent it became on Bumpy's continued effectiveness. Any sign of weakness would invite reevaluation. Respect, unlike fear, required constant reinforcement. As law enforcement strategies evolved and scrutiny intensified, the Mafia began to reassess all long-standing arrangements. Stability that once protected Bumpy now made him visible. The question was no longer whether respect had replaced fear, but whether respect alone could withstand changing conditions. And when those conditions finally shifted beyond anyone's control, the Mafia faced a decision that would test whether their restraint was permanent or merely temporary patience waiting for the right moment. When the system tried to break him, law, pressure, and isolation, approx. 900 words. Every power structure eventually attracts attention, and the longer it survives, the more suspicious it becomes. By the time Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson had secured respect from both Harlem and the Mafia, a new threat emerged, one that could not be negotiated with or restrained through loyalty. Law enforcement did not see stability as peace. They saw it as control, and control demanded investigation. Federal authorities began to recognize a pattern that troubled them deeply. Harlem remained unusually quiet compared to surrounding neighborhoods. Violence was contained. Criminal activity functioned with minimal disruption. To investigators, this was not coincidence, it was evidence of centralized authority. The very order that protected Bumpy now placed him under a microscope. Unlike rival gangs that exposed themselves through chaos, Bumpy's operations left few visible traces. This frustrated authorities. Traditional tactics failed to penetrate Harlem's silence. Informants were scarce. Witnesses disappeared into the fabric of the community. The absence of noise became the loudest signal of all. Pressure mounted steadily. Surveillance increased. Legal strategies shifted from direct confrontation to long-term attrition. The goal was no longer to provoke mistakes, it was to exhaust the system holding Harlem together. Bumpy understood this shift immediately. He had spent years mastering the streets, but the courtroom followed different rules. Arrests became more frequent. Charges accumulated, not always with strong evidence, but enough to disrupt momentum. Each legal battle drained resources, time, and energy. The system was not trying to defeat Bumpy in one strike. It was testing his endurance. The Mafia watched this development closely. Law enforcement pressure altered the risk equation. An ally under constant scrutiny became a liability. While they did not move against Bumpy, distance increased. The silent alliance that once protected him now operated cautiously, aware that proximity could invite exposure. Harlem felt the strain. Stability became harder to maintain as external forces tightened their grip. Rumors spread. Confidence wavered. The loyalty that once acted as a shield was tested by uncertainty. Bumpy remained composed, but the environment around him grew fragile. Isolation became his greatest challenge. Leadership required presence, yet visibility invited danger. Every decision carried greater consequences. Maintaining order without drawing attention became increasingly difficult. The balance he had perfected now required constant adjustment. Despite this pressure, Bumpy did not abandon his principles. He resisted panic. He avoided reckless moves. He continued to prioritize stability over confrontation. This restraint preserved what remained of the system, but it also limited his options. Adaptation came at the cost of flexibility. The authorities believed time was on their side. They understood that even the strongest structures weakened under sustained pressure. The goal was not immediate collapse, but gradual erosion. Remove the keystone, and everything else would follow. For the first time, Bumpy faced an enemy immune to reputation, loyalty, and negotiation. The law did not respect balance. It sought disruption. And as the pressure intensified, the question became unavoidable. Could the system he built survive without him at its center? As the walls began to close in, Bumpy Johnson confronted a reality he had long delayed: what would happen to Harlem, and to the Mafia's restraint, if he were finally removed from the equation. By the final phase of his reign, Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson had become more than a man operating within Harlem's underworld. He had become a structure, a stabilizing force whose influence extended beyond crime and into the fabric of the neighborhood itself. Even as pressure mounted and circumstances shifted, one truth remained unchanged: the Mafia never moved to eliminate him. This restraint was not rooted in sentiment. It was rooted in legacy. Over time, Bumpy's presence reshaped expectations. Harlem learned what order looked like under disciplined leadership. The Mafia learned the value of indirect control. Law enforcement learned that stability could conceal authority. Each institution adjusted around him, reinforcing his central role in a system that none could easily replace. Killing Bumpy would not have erased his influence. It would have amplified it. His death would have dismantled the balance that kept Harlem manageable. Factions would emerge. Violence would spike. Attention would intensify. The vacuum left behind would attract reckless figures driven by ambition rather than restraint. The cost of elimination outweighed its benefits. The Mafia understood this calculus. Their power thrived on continuity. Sudden disruptions endangered long-term objectives. Bumpy's leadership ensured predictability, even under pressure. His methods reduced chaos. Removing him would mean inheriting a problem they had no desire to manage directly. Bumpy's legacy also carried symbolic weight. He represented a form of autonomy that could not be erased through violence. His survival demonstrated that intelligence, restraint, and loyalty could coexist with power. This symbolism mattered not just to Harlem, but to the broader criminal ecosystem. As years passed, his story became a lesson. It illustrated the limits of fear as a governing tool. It showed that respect, when strategically cultivated, could be more effective than intimidation. The Mafia's decision to spare him was not an exception. It was an acknowledgement of evolving realities. Even as external forces weakened his position, the logic remained intact. Killing Bumpy would not restore control. It would destabilize it. The Mafia's restraint endured because the system he created continued to function, even under strain. Ultimately, Bumpy Johnson's greatest defense was not violence, alliances, or secrecy. It was the irreversible impact he had on Harlem's structure. His leadership altered expectations permanently. After him, control could no longer be imposed, it had to be managed. This is why the Mafia chose respect over execution. They recognized that some figures were more valuable alive than dead. Some systems were too complex to dismantle without consequences. Bumpy embodied both truths. His legacy outlived his freedom, his power, and even his presence. The streets remembered order. The Mafia remembered stability. And the underworld remembered a man who proved that survival was not always about strength, but about understanding the cost of destruction. Yet, even as his legacy endured, one final question remained unanswered. What happened when Harlem was finally forced to face a future without the man the Mafia had never dared to kill? When Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson was finally removed from Harlem, not by bullets, but by time and circumstance, the absence was immediate and unsettling. The streets did not erupt overnight, nor did order collapse in dramatic fashion. Instead, something more dangerous emerged: uncertainty. The system that had quietly governed Harlem for decades suddenly lacked its center of gravity. For years, Harlem had functioned under a delicate equilibrium. Crime existed, but it was contained. Power was present, but it was disciplined. Bumpy had acted as a filter, absorbing pressure from above and below, ensuring that chaos never fully surfaced. Without him, that filter vanished. The Mafia felt the shift almost instantly. What they had long predicted began to materialize, not because they acted, but because they did not. Harlem fractured into smaller power centers. Each believed it could fill the vacuum. None possessed Bumpy's restraint, intelligence, or legitimacy. Competition intensified, and with it came noise. Violence increased, not dramatically at first, but steadily. Disputes that Bumpy once resolved quietly now spilled into public view. Law enforcement attention surged. The same authorities who had struggled to penetrate Harlem's stability now found opportunity in its fragmentation. Investigations multiplied. Arrests followed. The neighborhood became louder, messier, and harder to manage. For the Mafia, this confirmed what they had always understood. Killing Bumpy would never have restored control. His absence proved that he had been a stabilizer, not an obstacle. Harlem was no longer predictable. Revenue streams suffered. Risk increased. The cost of indirect control rose sharply. Harlem itself changed. The sense of order that once existed, however flawed, was gone. Trust eroded. Loyalty fractured. Where Bumpy had unified competing interests under one disciplined structure, his successors lacked credibility. Authority became temporary and contested. This transformation reshaped how organized crime viewed leadership. Bumpy's model restraint, loyalty, intelligence, and community integration stood in contrast to the instability that followed. His survival had not been an accident. It had been a necessity for everyone involved. The Mafia's decision to respect him rather than eliminate him gained new clarity in hindsight. They had not spared him out of weakness. They had spared him out of foresight. Harlem without Bumpy was more dangerous than Harlem under his control. His legacy endured not through monuments or public recognition, but through absence. Every failure that followed highlighted what he had prevented. Every escalation underscored the value of the balance he maintained. In the end, the question was never why the Mafia chose not to kill Bumpy Johnson. The real question was whether anyone else could ever replace what he represented. History answered that decisively. Harlem learned that power without discipline leads to collapse. The Mafia learned that respect, when strategically applied, preserves control better than violence. And the underworld learned that some men are not untouchable because they are feared, but because removing them costs too much. Bumpy Johnson's story did not end with his survival. It ended with proof. Proof that stability is fragile. Proof that intelligence outlasts brutality. And proof that in a world ruled by fear, the most dangerous figure is the one who understands consequences better than everyone else. And even decades later, one truth still lingers over Harlem's past. Power can be taken, fear can fade, but the kind of respect Bumpy Johnson earned is almost impossible to recreate.